Hi. Hello. Good afternoon. Our honorable guest, Dr.Christianne Engel, and our guest, Pascal, our dean, Professor Lin, and Mrs. Lin, as well as Professor Zhao, Professor Chen, and all the faculty members and students in medical school and National Cheng Kung University. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mark Lin. I'm a professor in orthopedics in this medical school, and I'm the vice president for student affairs in National Cheng Kung University. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Christianne Engel, because she is going to talk about her grandfather, Albert Schweitzer. 史怀哲. Anyone who heard of Schweitzer, please give your big hands. Thank you very much. In order to introduce Christianne, she has been here 5 years ago. This is her second visit. And about his grandfather, I would like to share with you not only the knowledge, but also my feeling. So I'm going to speak to continue my introduction in my mother language with the permission of Christianne. Will that be okay? 今天的主题是史怀哲。如果没有听过史怀哲，在台湾不要想念大学。如果你不知道史怀哲是哪一国人，还有他的生平，不要想念医学院。史怀哲已经成为我的手上有一大堆的 list， 是台湾的医学生认为谁是他的典范，史怀哲永远是排在第一名。我们史怀哲的孙女5年前来的时候，她说95%的年轻人会把史怀哲当作他的医学的典范的时候，她高兴的眼泪都快流下来。5年前跟今年比较起来，更是的特别，因为史怀哲是在1875年出生，他在1965年去世。那么今年呢，却是他的100周年纪念。请问大家有谁知道为什么是100周年纪念？有没有人知道？这个日期好像兜不起来。这个100周年纪念是史怀哲到非洲行医的100年。这位同学要举手，好，他准备要回答。那么我先讲说，待会儿演讲完了以后，会有一个问答的时间，抢先问前2个问题的。那么这个Christianne 有准备2个小礼物要给大家。好，那么但是呢，这个100周年的纪念，大家或许知道他的生平，他做了什么。可是我想要问大家的是，其实它的核心价值是什么？什么是你可以学的？什么是你可以重复的？也就是说，你如果要成为史怀哲第2，怎么要做哪些事情才会成为史怀哲第2？你如果没有办法完全做到，你能够做到什么？这不是挑战，而是请大家重新再来做思考。当然，史怀哲从小并没有想当医生，大家都知道，他从小就是一个非常的。如果以台湾的教育来讲，也就是说是一个顶尖、卓越、可以拔尖的人才，但是是在音乐。他从学音乐开始，从进教堂学音乐开始，后来他学哲学，后来成为一个宗教家。有一天，他思考人生的意义，发现医学也可以帮助更多的人改善他的生活，尤其是非洲的时候，他在30岁开始学习医学。38岁正式到非洲去，这个过程当中，他经历很多的困难。以他对这种生命热爱，他其实后来又以敬畏生命，成为所谓的医学伦理的一个非常重要的基础。这也是为什么今天学医学生理的陈老师的这堂课，各位同学会在这里一个主要的原因。这个过程当中，他入狱过很多次，很多疾病上，或者是说几乎被威胁要被杀掉。从来不为所动，一定要回到非洲去做服务，这样子的精神伟不伟大？大家觉得伟大，请给一个热烈的鼓掌一下。 他是不是为了名、为了利？其实他有非常多次，他经历2次的世界大战，他有非常多次的机会可以得到诺贝尔奖，他都一概拒绝。可是你们会反驳我，可是他明明得过诺贝尔奖啊。那是因为有一天发现说，如果他拿到诺贝尔奖的话，他希望全世界反战，希望世界不要用核子弹。他发现只有诺贝尔奖的人讲的话，人家才会听的时候，他就说好吧，那你们就提名我，他就愿意当。所以他从来不为自己得这个奖，所以这是他精神伟大的地方。那么其实今天要介绍他的是他的孙女，我们的今天的贵宾，Christianne Engel， 他其实也是一样。他在6岁的时候，他其实也不是想当医生。他在6岁的时候，他是被 Mozart inspire 那一个曲子叫做 Little Night Music。请问会哼的请举手。Little Night Music。Exactly， 是谁在哼的？来举手一下。来，噔噔噔，来预备起，噔噔噔噔噔噔噔噔噔，就是这个 ，exactly。从小他就被这个 Mozart 这个 Little Night Music inspire， 他从小就是一个音乐家，他学钢琴，学管风琴，他其实对这样子的一个热爱。当他有机会再接触到的曾祖父的时候，其实他又被曾祖父的这样子的精神所感动，所以他后来也学了医学，他成为一个一般医学的专家，所以他现在也帮助世人。可是他也在做很多的音乐表演，包括2天以后要在台中表演。可是他表演也不是为了任何自己的目的，他从表演所得到的任何收获，其实都是为了要 donate 要捐献。其实今天这整个的活动，除了我们成大有这样子的一个机会，其实我是要这边正式的感谢中国医药大学，因为中国医药大学在黄荣仁校长这个叫做反思史怀哲之路当中，每年他们都到非洲去，然后甚至到史怀哲医院，是在那个Lambrand 的这个地方的这个史怀哲医院，他每年都去参访。那么就跟这个史怀哲的基金会，在今年3月12号的话，才正好在中国大学办了一个史怀哲100年非洲行医的典范与传承的一个研讨会。那么我今天能够成为一个介绍者，是因为我那时候被应邀去当一个分享者。那么去当分享者的一个原因是，他们查到我曾经写了一个文章，叫做梦到史怀哲。我写这篇文章的意思，其实完全都是因为在5年前，我那时候先介绍赖奇万教授，赖奇万教授再来介绍那个 Christianne 再来介绍他的曾祖父。这个是个很复杂的。不过我写了一篇文章叫《梦见史怀哲》之后，他们发现说我好像对史怀哲也有兴趣。事实上当然有，就跟各位一样，我们都有。所以呢，其实二手传播都不重要。因为我其实只是来分享我对于这个史怀哲一点点轻微的了解，并不多，但是最重要的了解。今天的主讲者，我不要占大家太多的时间，我们请用热烈的掌声来欢迎 Christianne Engel。 Please, thank you very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Dean Charles Lin, Professor Mark Lin, Professor Chin Hui Chen, Professor Ko Shi Chao, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to National Chung Kung University. It's a great pleasure to come here back and to talk to you. I'm deeply touched to experience how much your National Cheng Kung University is doing to promote the important legacy of my grandfather, Albert Schweitzer. It is especially people like you who are being inspired by his philosophy of reverence for life and to live it and teach it by example. My heartfelt thanks go to you all for your engagement, especially in this year of the 100th anniversary celebration of the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Lamborghini. I would like to start my reflections on my grandfather, Albert Schweitzer, from my own perspective. My grandfather left a profound and deeply cherished mark on me. There was a large affinity, deep love, respect, admiration, and an unending gratitude I felt towards him. In my thorough search to find a practical religion and philosophy, he gave me the answer. I found it in him as a great example in his writings and in his hospital in Lamborghini, Africa. The time that I spent with him each year in Africa between 1958 and 1965 while growing up was of most crucial importance. It brought me a happiness and inner fulfillment that words cannot describe. In my mind as a child, my grandfather's hospital in Lamborghini was paradise on earth, in which all life was respected and suffering found deliverance. I was a few years old when I met my grandfather for the first time. He had just come back from a 10-year uninterrupted stay in Africa. My mother, his only child, had longed for this day to come so that he could baptize her 4 children, including me. I clearly remember when I stood before him as he blessed me, and I shyly looked up to this tall, kind man with a big mustache, who from that day on I called grand-père, which means grandfather in French. During all my grandfather's visits in Europe after World War II, my siblings and I would spend vacations with him at his house in Alsace, France. It was such a lovely, warm, hospitable home. We would be amazed at how many guests from all over the world would be received or accommodated each day and be treated with so much kindness. My grandfather made no distinctions between a farmer, a simple worker, a prominent professor, or a member of a royal house. It would be very special to have an intimate family breakfast with our grandfather before all guests arrive, or to accompany him to the village church where he would practice the organ. On the way to the church, walking through the beautiful farmlands, he would urge us children not to pick any of the tempting, lovely flowers, but to respect and enjoy them as living beings. He would ask us to aid an animal which was in distress, as for example, to put into the grass an earthworm stranded on the pavement after rain. These were my first lessons of reverence for life. A dream came true for me on a memorable spring morning in 1958 when my mother received a letter from her father saying that he would like my younger sister Catherine and me to spend our next summer vacations with him in Africa. From then on, every year until his death, I spent a long school vacation with him at his hospital. During this time, I developed an even greater affection and admiration for him, without many words or commands, simply by his unique example. He influenced my life in depth and gave it an inner strength and richness. In Lamborghini, we people of different nations and backgrounds lived together harmoniously like a large family. We had meals together, we worked together, and we relaxed and celebrated together. Unforgettable to me are the moments after dinner when the hymn books would be distributed to all of us, and my grandfather would walk over to his tropical piano in the shine of a petroleum lamp. He would decide on one song to sing together and start with an improvised prelude, followed by the accompaniment of the song. Despite of the defects of the piano due to the very humid tropical climate and due to the destruction done by termites, he managed to give it a beautiful, impressive sound. My grandfather, whose radiance and influence was continuously felt amongst us, showed much understanding and compassion for people's troubles, and always gave generously of his person and of his time to help them. He loved people as well as animals, and he was deeply interested, especially in the problems of young people, and enjoyed speaking with them. I was very impressed to see that my grandfather allowed relatives of the patients to remain in the hospital as long as the ill ones were being treated. He realized the therapeutic value of family warmth before modern psychologists stressed it. I never saw any human neglect of patients there, as I've seen it in Western hospitals. My grandfather's jungle hospital was built like a village. The patients felt at home and were treated with respect and loving care. The results of medical treatment, as established statistics of the Lamborghini Hospital showed, were excellent. The hospital also took care of ill and homeless animals. My mother, for example, to our great joy and amusement, twice took care of an orphaned gorilla baby. The gorilla mother was shot by Africans, and they brought the baby to my grandfather in the hope of getting rewarded for it. Plants were also respected. I remember how hard it was for my grandfather when he had to cut down some of his majestic palm trees that endangered some of the hospital buildings during wild tornadoes. Life was only taken when absolutely necessary and never thoughtlessly. During the whole length of my stay in Lamborghini, I used to work in the hospital and learned a lot of medical skills at a very early age. My original wish to become a pianist turned into a desire to become a doctor. One very cherished moment with my grandfather was a rare piano lesson he gave me. At the end of the lesson, he all of a sudden began to improvise some dance music. He became like the young student he once was, who earned some money by entertaining during parties. He had a boyish, humorous twinkle in his eyes that I would also see when he would tell charming anecdotes, for example, during meals. Not only was he the serious intellectual and hard worker who lived in utmost modesty and simplicity in his African hospital, he was also a very warm person with a wonderful sense of humor and with the capacity to laugh at himself. Carrying heavy beams up from the river edge, my grandfather asked an African standing nearby to help him. The answer was, "No, doctor, I won't. I'm an intellectual." To this, my grandfather replied wistfully, "I too wanted to be an intellectual, but I don't seem to have succeeded." Another charming little episode that occurred after he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Amos, his large black dog, liked to chase the chickens in the hospital grounds. He was scolded by my grandfather, who said, "Amos, you can't do that anymore. Don't forget, we now have been given the Nobel Peace Prize." At the end of his life, in the 1960s, my grandfather had become a legendary figure. The old man in the tropical helmet in the African jungle, surrounded by his white-clad nurses, his black patients, and his animals. For some, he was a living saint, and for others, an anachronism. They saw only the old patriarch and had forgotten that in his younger years he had been a revolutionary, both in his words and in his actions. My grandfather was a man who decided to make his life his argument, not only to speak out his beliefs, but to give them concrete realizations. This led him to build a hospital in Africa, where he worked for more than 50 years. He was also a man of many facets. Schweitzer, the theologian, the philosopher, the musician, the writer, and the medical doctor. A complex man, he was surrounded by controversy as he developed and lived his ideas in many fields. Some were ridiculed and misunderstood when he put them forth. Half a century ago, he spoke of the interrelatedness of all living beings and the concept of reverence for life, when these notions had little meaning for most of his contemporaries. He went to Africa to give his skills as a surgeon, builder, and administrator when it was still the dark continent and help was limited to that provided from mission societies. He spoke out against the dangers of atomic weapons and nuclear testing when the world was still ecstatic about its technical progress and little concerned about ecological consequences of such progress. all his life, my grandfather fought for better understanding among all men and peace on this earth. My grandfather was born 1875 in a small village in Alsace, the tiny borderland between Germany and France, which changed sides according to the fortunes of war. His father was a Lutheran pastor, had been born French, and lived most of his life a German citizen, but died as a French. I'm quite certain that the combination of German and French cultures, which complement each other in Alsace, contributed greatly to the international character of my grandfather. He used to say, "I'm a child of Alsace and a citizen of the world." Another great influence on his later development was the village church in Günzbach, where my great-grandfather preached. This church was used by Protestants and Catholics alike. The Catholic chancel, to which the young Schweitzer used to look up, made a deep impression on him. In his childish imagination, it was the ultimate in magnificence, with its golden altar, tall candlesticks, and large gilt statues, all flooded in light coming through the chancel window. So, as a child, Schweitzer united Catholic Church with Protestant belief, and later on in his life, his mind expanded further to encompass the religions of the world. My grandfather lived a peaceful childhood with his parents, his 3 sisters, and 1 brother. He called his father his best friend. He was a sensitive child with an inquisitive mind and a great love for music. Even though he was outwardly happy, he recalls that, as far as I can remember, I was saddened by the amount of misery I saw in the world around me. I never really knew the qualified, useful joy of life. End of quote. He was particularly sensitive to the suffering of animals. The sight of an old, limping horse dragged forward by one man while another one kept beating it with a stick haunted him for weeks. And he couldn't understand why in his evening prayers he was only to include human beings. So when his mother had turned out the lights and left him, he added in the dark, "O Heavenly Father, protect and bless all things that have breath. Guard them from evil and let them sleep in peace." In the early years, nothing seemed to indicate that he was unusual. At school at first, he made such slow progress that his father once exclaimed, "Albert, if only you can learn that much, that at least you can become the mailman of our village." Years later, his father complained, "Albert goes from one extreme to the other. First, he has such difficulties to learn his ABC, and now he's studying so hard that he has no time for anybody anymore. My grandfather studied philosophy and theology at the University of Strasbourg, built up a career as a concert organist and musicologist, and started preaching. Before he was 30 years old, my grandfather enjoyed lucrative and successful careers in several fields, as a doctor of music, of theology, of philosophy. He was an ordained minister, a professor at the University of Strasbourg, a concert organist, and an author. Teaching, preaching, writing, giving organ concerts. My grandfather's life was a full and interesting one. His inquisitive mind led him to write provocative and highly acclaimed works in theology, philosophy, and musicology. Most of them have been translated in all major languages. He became known and appreciated, and a brilliant career in many fields seemed assured. Despite of his success, it became steadily clearer to him that he had not the inward right to take as a matter of course his happy youth, his good health, and his power of work. Darkly and confusedly, the thought worked in him that whoever is spared personal pain must feel himself called to help in diminishing the pain of others. He said, we must all carry our share of the misery which lies upon the world. When he was 21 and still a student, my grandfather made the decision that up to his 30th year, he would live for his studies, but thereafter would take a path of immediate service as a man to his fellow men. In the fall of 1904, on the eve of his 30th birthday, he found on his desk an appeal from the Paris Mission Society for help in their work in the Congo, where the native population was in desperate need. His search was over. He decided to study medicine because, as he said, I wanted to be a doctor that I might be able to work without having to talk. For years I had been given myself out in words. But in this new activity, I could not represent myself as talking about the religion of love, but only as an actual putting it into practice. End of quote. His friends in general did not understand his decision to begin the study of medicine. But my grandfather persisted, and there was one person who did understand him immediately. It was Helene Breslau, his future wife. They had been friends for several years. Helene, a teacher and a social worker, had been helping him with his writings. She at once decided to become a nurse so as to be able to accompany him to Africa and assist him in his work. At the end of his medical studies, they were married, and on Good Friday of 1913, so just 100 years ago, They set out for the great adventure of their lives. At Andende, near Lambaréné in equatorial Africa, my grandfather performed his first operations in an old chicken coop. As the patients arrived before he had even time to put up the necessary buildings for them. The First World War came as a terrible shock to them, not only because it interrupted his work at the hospital and as German citizens in a French colony. My grandparents became prisoners of war, but mostly because my grandfather saw in it a sign of the decline of Western civilization, of which he had become aware and afraid for a number of years. He had never been able to share the general optimism accompanying the steady technical progress of the 19th and the 20th centuries, nor the assumption that because of the progress in inventions and knowledge, mankind also progressed in the intellectual and ethical sphere. His impression, on the contrary, was that in the mental and spiritual life, we were not only below the level of past generations, but we were in many respects only living on their achievements. At the outbreak of the First World War, my grandfather started to work on his book, Philosophy of Civilization, trying to find the basis in rational thought upon which a viable and ethical civilization could be built. In 1915, while undertaking a journey on the African river Ogove in order to visit a patient, he found the answer to his philosophical struggle. He writes, "Slowly we crept upstream. Lost in thought, I sat on the deck of the barge, struggling to find the elementary and universal conception of the ethical, which I had not discovered in any philosophy. Sheet after sheet I covered with disconnected sentences to keep myself concentrated on the problem. Late on the third day, at the very moment when, at sunset, we were making our way through a herd of hippopotamuses, there flashed upon my mind, unforeseen and unthought, the phrase, reverence for life. The iron door had yielded, the path through the thicket had become visible." I think this was the greatest moment in my grandfather's life, one which marked all his further actions. When after the First World War, he rebuilt his hospital in a new location called Lambaréné, it was built as a practical realization of the idea of reverence for life, as a place where people of all colors, nationalities, and creeds could live together in harmony with domestic and wild animals, where each tree and plant was respected and life was only taken when necessary. However, my grandfather was a realist and quite aware that we live in a world, to quote him, submitted to the cruel and puzzling law of being obliged to live at the cost of other life and to incur again and again the guilt of destroying and injuring life. End of quote. My grandfather sought the ethical imperative of reverence for life, which contained for him a profound attitude of awe towards the wonder of life, proceeded from the most elemental description of existence which he could formulate. I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. End of quote. By will to live, he meant the innate urge and joy of each living being attempting to actualize his highest potential, not shutting his eyes to the conflicts which oppose living beings to living beings. He only urges us to greater thoughtfulness and sensitivity in our choices. My grandfather felt strongly that such an attitude could become the basis for a new, more believable and livable ethics, being rooted in the reality of biological relatedness, which we all can see and feel. When my grandfather was asked what he considered to be his most important contribution, he used to reply that it was his contributions as a philosopher. His philosophy of reverence for life also compelled him to his voice heard for the cause of peace, and specifically in warning of the dangers of the testing and use of nuclear weapons. Between 1913 and the end of his life in 1965, his hospital steadily grew, and besides his medical work, he continued to write and publish books. He was being showered with honors and innumerable awards. But in 1952, with being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, a distinct new responsibility and burden had added to his already enormous workload. The Nobel Peace Prize carried with it an obligation, and my grandfather felt very strongly that it was his duty to do something to become worthy of the honor. In his acceptance speech, he said, "Man has become a superman. His superhumanity arises from the fact that through his acquisition of knowledge and power, he not only disposes of his own body, but also can command and utilize the powers that reside in nature itself. This Superman suffers, however, from a fatal spiritual imperfection. He does not possess the superman reason which should accompany his superhuman might. Knowledge and power have produced results that have become more fatal than helpful to him. End of quote. This was a brief mention in general terms of the dangers of nuclear war. Even at time, my grandfather, though now universal known and greatly respected, and pleading the cause of peace in Oslo, shied away from getting involved in matters construed to be of political nature. Contacts with Einstein, Nehru, Robert Oppenheimer, Martin Buber, Pierre-Dominique Pier, amongst others, meeting with Bertrand Russell in London, attending a conference with concerned Nobel laureates in Lindau. All these put a kind of moral pressure on him. In 1957, Norman Cousins, who had already been in touch by letters with my grandfather, came to visit him in Lamborghini. One of the purposes of the trip was to urge my grandfather to make some statement on world peace. He considered him to be one of the very few individuals in the world whose voice would be widely heard and would carry unique authority. Still, my grandfather resisted, saying, "All my life, I have carefully stayed away from making pronouncement on public matters. It was not because I had no interest in world affairs or politics. It was just that I felt that my connection with the outside world should grow out of my work or sought in the field of theology and philosophy or music. I have tried to relate myself to the problems of all humankind rather than to become involved in political disputes. I wanted to be one man speaking to another man." End of quote. After Norman Cousins repeatedly insisted, my grandfather finally decided to speak out with the objective of addressing himself mainly to the dangers of nuclear testing. His statement, entitled "A Declaration of Conscience," was released in April 1957. It was the beginning of an intense period of activity on behalf of alerting individual citizens and world leaders to the frightful dangers inherent in the nuclear arms race. By then, my grandfather was 82 years old, still adding buildings to his hospital and supervising its medical activities. And despite the complexities, he added an impressive knowledge of scientific matters, keeping abreast of the developments in the nuclear field. At the end of 1957, my grandfather received a request from Linus Pauling to add his signature to an appeal by scientists of many countries, urging an international agreement to stop nuclear weapon tests. He signed the petition along with 36 other Nobel laureates and over 9,000 other scientists. But most important, he worked on 3 successive appeals for which he had an invitation from Radio Oslo. From then on, a worldwide correspondence and cooperation with leaders of the movement against atomic weapons and testing took a great deal of his time. In the manner in which this fight should be conducted, my grandfather differed with many of the other leaders. Rather than relying on the press or other communication media, or upon large international organizations of conferences, he considered as most effective the stirring up of public opinion. He wanted to address himself as a man to his fellow man and make them aware that their human rights and international law were being violated. He said, public opinion must realize that atomic weapons contradict international law. End of quote. By the end of 1958, a trilateral moratorium was concluded between the USA, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain on nuclear weapon tests. It lasted until 1960, when on February 13th, France detonated its first nuclear explosion in the Sahara. Test ban negotiations continued, but with no agreement. The testing was resumed by all great powers. Norman Cousins urged my grandfather to send his objections to the resumption of testing to President Kennedy. But my grandfather felt that to criticize the president would harm the influence he might have in the USA. Despite his initial refusal, after much hesitation, in April 1962, my grandfather sent a letter to President Kennedy pleading for disarmament and a test ban treaty. In his answer, President Kennedy wrote, "No decision I have taken in my administration has given me more concern and sorrow than the decision to resume nuclear testing." End of quote. However, a very positive development was the partial test ban treaty that was concluded between the USA and the Soviet Union and signed in Moscow in August 1963. In addition to all his other contributions, my grandfather spared no effort until his death in 1965 at the age of 90 to do his best to arouse world opinion and to make it aware of the world-threatening danger of nuclear arms. In conclusion, I would like to give, in the words of my grandfather, a short summary of his elemental thoughts on the philosophy of reverence for life. This is, as he says, his most important contribution for humanity. Here are his words. I call forth humanity to the ethic of reverence for life. This ethic does not make any distinction between more worthy and less worthy life, higher life and lower life. It rejects any such distinction. The attempt to accept universally applicable value distinctions amongst living creatures fundamentally implies assessing them according to whether they appear to us humans, based on our feelings, to be closer to us or further away. But this is a completely subjective judgment. For who among us knows the meaning of other living beings in themselves and in the world as a whole? The consequences of such a distinction is then the view that there is worthless life, the destruction or impairment of which is allowed. Depending on the circumstances, worthless life is understood to be insects or members of primitive cultures. To the truly ethical man, all life is sacred. The direct fact in the consciousness of man is this: I'm life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. This general affirmation of life is a spiritual act in which man ceases to live arbitrarily. Rather, he begins to devote himself with reverence to his life in order to give it its true worth. The man who has come to think in this manner experiences at the same time the necessity of bringing to all will to live the same reverence for life as for his own. Thus, he experiences other life within his own life. And then for him, goodness consists in sustaining and promoting life, in bringing life capable of development to its highest values. For him, evil now becomes the destruction of life, the obstruction of the development of life that is capable of development. This is the absolute, logical, necessary, basic principle of what is ethical. Through the ethic of reverence for life, we come into a spiritual relationship with the world. In my life, I've always tried to stay young in my thought and feeling. And I've again and again wrestled with the facts and with my experience of belief in goodness and truth. In this age, in which violence hides behind the lie and thus so frightfully rules the world as never before, I still continue to be convinced that truth, peacefulness, and love, gentleness and kindness are the power above all power. The world will belong to them if only enough men think and embody with sufficient purity and constancy the thoughts of life and truth, of gentleness and peacefulness. All ordinary forms of power in this world create their own limits, for they create opposing powers which sooner or later will become equal or superior. But kindness acts simply and constantly. It does not create tension, through which it cancels itself out, but rather it relaxes the existing tensions. It eliminates mistrust and misunderstandings. In awakening kindness, it reinforces itself. Therefore, it is the most purposeful and most intensive force. The kindness that a person radiates into the world works on the hearts of other people and on their thought. It is our senseless transgression that we do not dare to be serious enough with kindness. We again and again want to shift off the heavy burden without making use of the lever that can increase our power by 100-fold. An unfathomably deep truth lies in the words of Jesus. Blessed are the meek, for they shall possess the earth. When in spring the wilted gray of the meadow makes room for the green, it is because millions of sprouts burst forth anew from the roots. Thus too can the spiritual renewal which must come for our age take place in no other way than that many reconstructure their ethos and ideals through contemplation of the essence of the truly good. If the trees brings forth anew the same fruit year after year, all worthy ideas in the thought of humanity must also be reborn from generation to generation. A new renaissance must come, much greater than that in which we emerge from the Middle Ages. A great renaissance in which mankind discovers that the ethical is the highest truth and the highest purpose, and thus is liberation from that impoverished sense of reality within which it drags itself along. I still continue in the words of my grandfather. I would like to be a simple forerunner of this Renaissance. I have the courage to believe in a new humanity because I am convinced that the ethos of humanity, which in the past was viewed only as a noble emotion is rooted in a worldview emanating from elemental thinking that can be universally communicated. Thus, it possesses a persuasive force that it never before had, and is able to engage dynamically with reality and to come into its own. Thank you.
谢谢大家热情的掌声。Thank you for your big hands. I think NCKU will be proud of you for your emotions. And now I am going to open for questions and comments and or discussions. And I will leave 5 minutes before the end of this hour for a group photo. So I want to invite questions. And Christianne, would you stand up and look who is, please, okay. Who is the first to ask question? 1, 2, 3. This one, okay. Is it okay? Okay, would you give us your question?
Okay, my name is Samantha, and thank you, Christianne, for your talk. I felt that I met your grandfather in person because you really told us about his life story. And my question will be, have you ever, I know that, from your talk, I learned that your grandfather spent a long time away from home and that you didn't really spend time with him, like, in person. So have you ever felt that the patients in Africa have stolen your grandfather from you, or were you really proud of him, like, of what he had done? Yeah, that was my question.
I think I had a little difficulty to understand that my grandfather.
Have you ever felt that your grandfather was stolen from you because you didn't really get the time to spend with him?
That the family.
Yeah, with the family.
Well, that certainly is true. My grandfather was very, very busy, and he was so taken by his mission. Also, when he met his wife, his future wife, he was very much in love with her, but he did not want to get married and have a family because he had decided to do humanitarian work. That was his first priority. And he did not want to have the suffering for his wife. But they made a decision, both, that always in their relationship, the work for humanity will be first. And my grandmother agreed, and then they got married. But also they actually hadn't planned to have children. That was an accident. My mother was an accident, but it was a wonderful accident. Because she was the one who continued afterwards his work, and it was a big blessing. But you're right, when you do such a work, it is very difficult to have a normal family life. But I felt when I was always with him, especially in Africa, every night I would go to his room and we would have a little discussion. And just not only this personal relationship, also just seeing him all the time, everywhere in the hospital. You know, he was always present. In the center, actually, he had his desk during the day in the pharmacy. We called that pharmacy, where all the doctors actually also had their consultation room. So he was always there, present. So you never had the feeling that he was somewhere, a person not reachable. He was reachable. And anybody who had problems could go to him. He had always an open door. And especially, he loved young people. He would have loved to be here and talk to you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Give her a present.
Oh.
Yeah.
For the person who asked the first question gets a present.
Okay.
This is a recording of Mozart piano concertos. I'm very sorry that I can't give you all a recording, which I would love to, because I think Mozart will help you relax. How many of you are playing an instrument?
Oh.
Wow.
Wow.
Very
Many.
impressive. Are you playing in an orchestra?
Oh. 有谁在 orchestra?
Wonderful. So you know what I'm speaking about, how music, but also those who don't play an instrument, it gives us certain peace of mind, it gives us a harmonious feeling to listen to classical music. So enjoy.
Yeah. 我想回答刚刚回答的第一个问题，其实很简单，就是其实你要做大爱，一定要牺牲。但是如果能够找到跟你愿意同样是牺牲这样志同道合的人，其实还是可以保持家庭的生活，而且可以培养出非常优秀的下一代，或者是好几代这样子。那么在第二个问题，OK，因为实在是不太明，因为他一直在举手，而且坐得比较近所以 OK， 那个因为 Christianne 一直眼睛盯着他 ，OK， 好，请问问题。
Okay. First, I want to thank you for the wonderful talk. And I totally agree that you said that kindness and gentleness is the power above all power. And I'm really looking forward to the renaissance that you say ethical is the highest truth and purpose. But I know that your grandfather, Dr. Albert Schweitzer, had worked his all life to encourage this kind of thing to happen, this kind of renaissance to happen. But what do you think you can encourage us to do to have a progress in this kind of renaissance? This is the kind of thing that we were all willing to see, but we're not seeing a lot in the world now.
That's right, and that's very sad. Well, what my grandfather always said is that if the idealism that as young people we feel, the true, pure idealism, if we could keep that on, the world would look totally different. It would be a harmonious, peaceful world. Because as we grow up, we all have a pure feeling we all have these beautiful ideals. And then as we grow up, we see around us violence, we see discouragement. And what I could tell you is keep this idealism alive. Always look to, I could call it your inner voice. And what you can do is, you don't have to do a big work like my grandfather did. This is not what anybody would expect. You can do little things. Just be kind to I always say charity or goodness starts at home. Be good to your siblings, to your parents, and from then on, you radiate out to the outer world. And it's the simple thing, the little humanitarian service. You see an old lady struggling with luggage, you help her when she goes shopping. Just little things like this make the difference. And if you are privileged and you have a lot of energy and you can build up to it. But anything starts, and I think this is a Chinese proverb, a long journey starts with one step. That is from a, yeah. So, but never forget this inner voice, this purity inside you, because that's also how you can understand the other life. We can only understand it within ourselves. That's what is the philosophy of my grandfather. It is in ourselves that we can understand also this philosophy of reverence for life.
Okay. Thank you for the question and for your answers. Thank you very much. And yes, yes.
Okay.
And before we can go for anything else, I think you have a video to show us, right?
Yeah.
You have a video? Okay.
Yeah.
Can we play the video right now?
This
Okay.
is a day in Lamborghini. I didn't speak so much about Lamborghini, but because the most important thing is really his thoughts. But now you will see.
OK， 谁在上面可以帮忙 play 一下吗？那么在准备这个一个10分钟左右的影片当中哈，就是刚刚说这个在 Lamborghini 的这个史怀哲医院哈，现在还在 working。那事实上有关 ，so it is about your one day staying in Lamborghini.
Yeah, but later, not after.
Okay.
After the death of my grandfather, actually it was done a few years ago.
Okay, that's great. Okay, I think it is coming. Yeah.
More than 90 years ago, the Albert Schweitzer Hospital was founded on the banks of the Ogowe River in the rainforest of Gabon. Since then, patients have found medical care, comfort, and healing at this hospital, created by renowned humanitarian and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Dr. Albert Schweitzer. By the age of 30, Albert Schweitzer was a celebrated musician, respected philosopher, and theologian, and a widely acclaimed expert on Johann Sebastian Bach. Yet in 1905, to enter medical school with plans of serving the sick in Africa for the rest of his life. In 1913, he opened the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Lambaréné, providing medical care based on his ethic of reverence for life. Today, other physicians at the hospital carry on Schweitzer's tradition of service. This morning in the hospital's maternity ward, Dr. Benito, pediatrician and chief of medicine, examines newborns. 800 children are born here each year. The hospital provides care for all who need medical care without any exception.
Ce qui est essentiel dans cet hôpital, c'est qu'on met avant tout la vie de l'individu, la vie de l'enfant, la vie de la mère, la vie de la personne d'abord. C'est ça qui est important. Non, ça c'est pas de sel normal. Une diarrhée même. Vous allez retourner en pédiatrie. Hein. C'est pas bien. Ceux qui peuvent payer, ils payent, et ceux qui ne peuvent pas payer, en réalité, ils ne payent pas. Hein. C'est ça la réalité.
Even with a population lacking resources on a continent where the most serious pandemic diseases are rampant, the Schweitzer Hospital faces problems head-on in the tradition of its founders. People like Dr. Kwashi, a surgeon at the hospital where over 1,500 operations are performed annually, work daily to deliver care, ranging from help for burned children in village cooking fires like this one to complex orthopedic surgery for victims of motor vehicle accidents and other traumas.
C'est vraiment un hôpital pour tous, c'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a pas de distinction ni de catégorie sociale, ni de race, ni d'ethnie. Deuxièmement, c'est un hôpital de brousse, mais comme vous voyez, c'est un hôpital plutôt moderne. Et ça, c'est un peu cette contradiction qui en fait une des deuxièmes spécificités. La troisième spécificité, à mon avis, c'est le caractère multiethnique, multinational de différents personnels Ça fait qu'on a une approche multiculturelle à nos problèmes et ça nous permet aussi d'élargir un peu les horizons.
The success of the hospital almost 100 years after its founding is due in large part to Albert Schweitzer's belief that it was crucial to adopt the local way of life at the hospital rather than impose a European model in the jungle. The hospital today remains a village hospital where caregivers and staff live on site. The village hospital also includes a daycare center, a school, a retreat center, a market, a cafeteria, an art center, and even a soccer team. Villagers replanting Dr. Schweitzer's garden and performing other tasks constitute an evolving microeconomy which supports the hospital. In the past, many of the hospital staff were expatriates, mostly European. Today, over 90% of the staff are Gabonese, and most of the rest are African. The care of individual patients is at the heart of the work done in the hospital each and every day. In the waiting room of the Polyclinic, built 30 years ago with funds from the United States, a crowd of patients has gathered under Dr. Schweitzer's watchful gaze. Dr. Horvath, a specialist in internal medicine, helps as many patients as he can each and every day.
J'ai le sentiment qu'on a plus en plus de patients qui viennent de plus loin, de plus en plus loin.
The growing number of patients in a region of severe poverty strains the hospital's finances. If a patient can pay, a visit costs $10 American, including a week of free medication. Sick patients who cannot pay still receive the same high-quality care as those who can afford hospital services. This morning, more than 80 children will be vaccinated against diseases like measles and tetanus. The PMI program, Protection of Mothers and Infants, is one of the highest priorities of the Schweitzer Hospital, but is just one element of the hospital's expanding preventive medical service. For mothers and children who can't come to the hospital goes to them. The community health program is comprised of a rapidly growing network of village-based health centers, which expand the hospital's HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria services throughout the region. Year-round, these remote jungle village clinics are staffed by nurses who provide the support needed by those who would not otherwise have ready access to health care. Here, Dr. Diallo visits the village of Dengue. She sees patients in one of the community health program's clinics. Launched by the American Albert Schweitzer Fellowship in close collaboration with Gabon's National Ministry of Health, the community health program is a lasting testament to Dr. Schweitzer's commitment to the people of Gabon. Returning to the hospital, we find Dr. Horvath at work in the internal medicine pavilion. For this doctor, providing care in the spirit of Albert Schweitzer is first of all learning how to understand and adapt to one's patients. Not easy when you don't speak the Fang dialect.
Dites à elle qu'elle serre tous les deux mains en même temps. Mais elle est devenue fatiguée d'un jour à l'autre. Eh bien, on continue, mais il faut la mettre assise comme ça et parler à elle de temps en temps. Il ne faut pas la laisser tout le temps dormir. Et essayer quand même à donner à manger. Parce que sans mangeant, ça n'ira pas. Il faut. OK, maman?
But Dr. Horvath has more serious problems than language. The increasing number of patients hospitalized with AIDS, who now occupy the majority of adult beds, has caused new challenges for the hospital staff. Many patients are also sick with TB. The hospital has only recently been able to provide antiviral medications for AIDS and must now take responsibility for the rigorous follow-up of many patients. TB patients require treatment for 8 months following an initial period of isolation, but the hospital has only 4 isolation rooms. Another major public health problem is malaria, which kills more than 1 million African children each year, most less than 5 years old. The Schweitzer Hospital's laboratory, world-renowned for its advancements in malaria research, has recently begun work on AIDS and tuberculosis. The laboratory is also celebrated for its other clinical and basic science studies and as a training site for African physicians and scientists. The hospital's effectiveness in treating malaria with the laboratory support is remarkable. Children with severe malaria cared for at the Schweitzer Hospital have the lowest documented mortality rate in all of Africa. And laboratory staff often leave the hospital grounds to follow up on patients in their home villages.
Le paludisme tue environ 3 millions de personnes par an. Donc c'est un chiffre effarant. L'objectif pour nous, c'est d'emmagasiner le maximum d'informations de façon à aboutir à terme à un vaccin.
International laboratory staff have published over 200 journal articles since 1996, and over 45 doctoral dissertations have been completed at the lab since 2002. From the beginning, Dr. Schweitzer understood that anyone involved with the hospital must join as a partner in its work. Here, women from the village have come to wash and iron the hospital's linens. Nearby, in one of the communal kitchen areas, Mary Jeanne cooks fish for her younger brother, Pierre, who is a patient. She is his guardian in the system Dr. Schweitzer created, based on his insight that patients feel and heal better in an environment with family nearby. As Pierre's guardian, Mary Jeanne feeds and bathes him and helps in other ways. It's one example of the shared responsibility of care that families and the hospital assume at the Albert Schweitzer Hospital. Right now, Pierre will enjoy his fish as he recovers from surgery for a strangulated hernia. These two young guardians help build a staircase on the hospital grounds.
Dans le village, tout le monde, nous sommes tous un. Du boulot à faire et puis tout le monde les met à main. Ça dépend des volontaires.
It's the end of the day in Lambrene. To one side of the hospital complex is the Village of Light, an area for patients with leprosy that Dr. Schweitzer built with Nobel Peace Prize funds. Here, Dr. Kwashi makes his weekly visits.
C'est le village des lépreux qui a été construit par le docteur, des mains du docteur Schweitzer lui-même. Bonjour, bonjour. Bonjour, papa. Ça va? Alors, ici, nous sommes dans la case, l'atelier du papa. Lui, il fait de façon artisanale des tam-tams.
Quand j'étais avec le docteur Schweitzer, il nous disait qu'il faut travailler. Parce qu'au moment qu'on travaille, vraiment, ça nous soulage beaucoup.
Il avait les idées, hein, beaucoup même. C'est génial.
Today's hospital has evolved to deal with contemporary problems while staying true to Schweitzer's original hospital plan. But to accommodate the increasing numbers of patients and visitors, historic buildings are today being renovated and restored. Anne-Marie, a longtime nurse at the hospital, gives us a tour.
C'était abandonné, bien cassé. Maintenant, il est en train de refaire les bâtiments. Ça me plaît beaucoup. Parce que ça me fait penser à mon enfance. Parce que j'ai connu le docteur Schweitzer. Les souvenirs, c'était avec mes copines. On allait quelquefois prendre des fruits sans permission. Je sais qu'il m'a attrapé une fois au carambolier. Il m'a donné quelques claques et puis ça ne faisait même pas mal. Devant moi, c'est la maternité où je suis née. Moi-même, je suis née et j'ai fait même 2 de mes premières filles là, sur la même table, dans la même salle. Ce bâtiment-là, juste là, où il y a la porte là, où l'escalier est cassé. C'est la salle d'accouchement. Pour moi, c'est comme mon village. Je crois que le docteur Schweitzer est venu aider les Africains.
Dr. Schweitzer devoted more than 20 years of his life to establishing a hospital world-renowned for its service to the people of the Lambrene region. Today, more than 40 years after his death, the Schweitzer Hospital continues to provide skilled and compassionate care to thousands of patients each year in a world where the Schweitzer ethic of reverence for life is more important than ever before. Since 1974, the International Foundation of the Albert Schweitzer Hospital has owned and operated the hospital as an independent, non-governmental organization with crucial support from Europe and the United States, dedicated international staff, comprehensive curative and preventive medicine services, a world-class scientific laboratory, financial management systems, and an historic sense of mission make the hospital unique. Supporters like you can help ensure that the hospital continues as a symbol of hope and health in the 21st century.
请陈老师到前面来。现在是这样子哈，为什么请前7位老师到这边来？因为Christianne 有一个 CD， 这个 CD 本来是要送给陈老师的。陈老师啊，有听到吗？本来要送给你的，我说本来，但是因为我看同学有很多眼睛睁得很大的，你愿不愿意把它捐出来送给同学？没问题。好，现在我请陈老师站在这边，只剩下最后一个机会，我喊1、2、3，举手了，来，陈老师，你决定是哪一个？你要给哪一位？
给学生啊。
给学生。助教不要举手，给学生，那就是这位同学来，请你问问题。
可以请你分享一个跟你祖父的故事吗？就是。
你要自己用英文讲吗？啊，讲一下，别惊，慢慢来讲，不要紧。来，自己讲来。
Could you share a story of your grandfather and you? A story can you share with us?
掌声给他鼓励一下好了哈。
There are many stories, but maybe the earliest is my grandfather was going to the church to play the organ, and I always loved to follow him. And this story happened when I was 6 years old. So we were walking to the church, and it was just after a rain. And all of a sudden, I saw my grandfather bending down, and he lifted up an earthworm and put it gently into the grass. And for me, this action, I'll never forget that. That was my first lesson of reverence for life. To save this worm which was stranded on the asphalt and would have been dried out when the sun comes out. And So I still do that even now. I pick up the earthworms when I see them. Or another example, when I'm swimming and I see a little insect struggling to be drowned, I take it out. All these little things is what my grandfather taught me. Or thinking of little, he, when I used to go to his room in Lamborghini, he had on one side his cat, and on the other side he had made a little paper tunnel because there were lots of ants, and they would always crawl all over his table, and the cat would tap at them and kill them. So this harmony of seeing him writing or reading, the cat on one side, sitting on some important documents. On the other side, he had made this paper tunnel, and in the paper tunnel he had put a little sugar. So he disciplined the ants. They would come up on his desk, but right away they would go through the paper tunnel and then go down again. So, but there are lots of these charming stories. By the way, I have to tell you that my grandfather had a wonderful sense of humor. And he thought, you know, to withstand all these difficulties in, you know, being isolated in the jungle, far away from your family, your friend, from everything, you had to have a sense of humor to sustain. And yeah, lots of stories.
好，谢谢哈，我想这个我来代转就好了哈。Christiane, I want you to go back to the stage first because I want, on behalf of medical school, I want to send you a gift, and because of there is only enough light on the stage. So.
Do I have to have that in my hand? No. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to invite you to sit over here, and I want to ask all the medical students to come closer. Please close up to the middle. And because I think on that corner, I cannot, actually the photographer cannot see you from the corner. So you have to go from my hands. You have to go inside my hand. Please come closer. Actually, you can sit in the front side, in the front seat.